Imagine this. It's July 2023, and a small town in southern Italy records a temperature of 48.8 degrees Celsius, 8 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest ever documented in Europe. Meanwhile, wildfires rage across Canada, scorching millions of acres and blanketing cities thousands of miles away in choking smoke. In the same summer, torrential rains in South Korea lead to devastating floods, displacing thousands and leaving a trail of destruction. These events are not isolated anomalies. They are part of an unmistakable global pattern, one that scientists have been warning us about for decades. Yet amidst this cascade of evidence, a significant portion of the population remains unconvinced. Some dismiss the climate crisis outright, calling it a hoax. Others acknowledge it but downplay human responsibility, claiming it's just part of Earth's natural cycles. And then there are those who believe it's a manufactured crisis, designed to push political agendas or impose draconian restrictions on personal freedoms. These voices aren't just fringe. They've shaped public discourse, stalled meaningful action, and created deep divides in how we approach one of the most pressing challenges of our time. The stakes couldn't be higher. Climate change isn't some distant, abstract threat. It's here, reshaping our lives in real time. It's affecting how we grow food, how we build homes, and even how we breathe. The science is clear, yet the debate rages on, not because of uncertainty about the facts, but because of the powerful influence of denial. Climate change denial isn't just skepticism. It's a deliberate effort to sow doubt, fueled by a combination of fear, misinformation, and vested interests. It's a story of human resistance to inconvenient truths and the forces that exploit that resistance for profit and power. I'm Ronnie. Welcome to Tangled Theories, a podcast diving deep into some of the world's most intense conspiracy theories. If you enjoy this content, like and subscribe to my channel and leave me a comment. In today's episode, we're diving headfirst into this tangled web of denial. We'll explore where these ideas come from, why they persist despite overwhelming evidence, and how they've shaped public understanding or misunderstanding of the climate crisis. More importantly, we'll look at the cost of this denial, not just in terms of delayed action, but in the lives and futures it affects. This is more than a battle over science. It's a battle over our collective ability to face reality, to take responsibility, and to build a future that works for everyone. Let's unravel the story together. The origins of climate change denial can be traced back to a time when the implications of global warming began to take shape in scientific discourse, and more importantly, in public policy discussions. In the late 20th century, as evidence of human impact on the planet's climate grew undeniable, industries with a financial stake in fossil fuels recognized the existential threat posed by this science, not just to the environment, but to their bottom line. What followed was a deliberate and well-coordinated campaign to sow doubt, muddy the waters, and derail meaningful action. In the 1980s, as climate science advanced and the connection between carbon dioxide emissions and global warming became clearer, oil companies and energy corporations began funding research and public relations campaigns to challenge the emerging consensus. Among the most infamous players was ExxonMobil. Internal documents from the company, later revealed to the public, showed that their own scientists had confirmed the role of fossil fuels in driving climate change as early as the 1970s. Instead of addressing the issue, ExxonMobil chose another path. They invested millions in casting doubt on the science, hiring public relations firms and think tanks to question the severity of the problem and the reliability of the data. One of the most significant strategies used by these corporations was to frame climate science as uncertain and unsettled, even when the evidence was overwhelming. The goal wasn't to disprove climate change. It couldn't be. But to manufacture enough uncertainty to delay action. If people believed that the science was still out for debate, there would be less pressure on governments to implement regulations that could hurt these industries' profits. This approach drew directly from the playbook of the tobacco industry, which had spent decades denying the link between smoking and cancer by emphasizing doubt rather than evidence. At the same time, climate change denial found fertile ground in political ideologies that resisted government intervention. The growing environmental movement of the 1970s and 1980s had already sparked backlash from conservative thinkers who viewed regulation as an attack on free market principles. Climate change, with its call for sweeping changes in energy production, industrial practices, and consumption patterns, became a flashpoint in this ideological battle. For many, accepting the reality of climate change meant accepting the need for policies that challenged deeply held beliefs about economic freedom and limited government. It wasn't just about the science, it was about what the science demanded. Think tanks like the Heartland Institute and the Competitive Enterprise Institute became key players in the denial movement, producing reports, organizing conferences, and lobbying politicians to resist climate action. These organizations often received funding from fossil fuel companies, creating a feedback loop in which corporate interests and ideological resistance reinforced one another. Their messaging was simple yet effective. Climate change was overblown, the costs of addressing it were too high, and any action would amount to government overreach. Media played its part as well. As climate change began to enter the public consciousness in the 1980s and 1990s, news outlets often presented the issue as a debate, giving equal weight to the overwhelming majority of scientists who supported the evidence and the small minority who denied it. This false balance created the impression that there was significant disagreement within the scientific community, further fueling public skepticism. By the time the first major international climate agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, was introduced in 1997, climate change denial had become deeply entrenched. Lobbyists, think tanks, and corporations were actively working to prevent its ratification, particularly in the United States. Their efforts were successful. The U.S. ultimately refused to sign the agreement, citing concerns about economic impacts and the need for developing nations to shoulder more responsibility. This marked a turning point where climate change denial moved from fringe skepticism to a mainstream political stance. These early roots of climate change denial reveal how economic interests, ideological resistance, and strategic misinformation combine to shape public perception. What began as a calculated effort to protect corporate profits has evolved into a broader cultural and political phenomenon, with denial becoming a defining feature of resistance to climate action. Understanding this history is essential to unraveling how we arrived at the present moment, where the science is clearer than ever, but the battle for public understanding and action continues. The arguments put forward by climate change denialists are striking not because of their diversity, but because of their resilience. Despite decades of evidence and an overwhelming scientific consensus, these claims persist, adapted to fit the moment and amplified by those with vested interests. Each claim has its origins in specific social, political, and economic contexts, and understanding their roots is key to dismantling their influence. The most sweeping claim made by denialists is that climate change is a hoax. This argument is as much a political rallying cry as it is a rejection of science. The origins of this assertion can be traced back to the deliberate misinformation campaigns funded by fossil fuel companies and amplified by conservative media outlets. Figures like Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, one of the most vocal climate change skeptics in the U.S. Congress, became symbols of this viewpoint. Inhofe famously brought a snowball onto the Senate floor in 2015 to mock global warming, arguing that cold weather disproved the entire concept of climate change. While such gestures may seem absurd, they resonate with a significant audience by reducing a complex issue to an easily digestible and dismissible narrative. The claim that climate change is a hoax has been further fueled by high-profile political figures, such as former U.S. President Donald Trump, who repeatedly referred to global warming as a hoax invented by China to weaken American manufacturing. This framing not only dismisses the science, but also taps into broader fears of economic decline and foreign competition. By casting climate change as a conspiracy, proponents of this argument shift the focus away from environmental concerns and toward nationalistic and economic anxieties. Another common argument is that the climate is always changing naturally. This claim is rooted in a basic truth. The Earth's climate has indeed fluctuated throughout its history. Ice ages, warm periods, and shifts in atmospheric composition have all occurred over millions of years, driven by natural factors like volcanic activity, solar radiation, and changes in Earth's orbit. Denialists leverage this fact to suggest that current climate changes are merely part of this natural variability, unrelated to human activity. This argument gained traction because it seems plausible at first glance. After all, if the climate has changed before, why should we assume that humans are responsible now? However, this perspective ignores the overwhelming evidence that the current rate and scale of change are unprecedented in human history. The increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide and global temperatures over the past century aligns directly with industrial activity and the burning of fossil fuels, a pattern that cannot be explained by natural factors alone. Despite this, the natural change argument remains appealing to those who are either unaware of the evidence or unwilling to confront its implications. The idea that it's not caused by humans builds on this foundation, taking the natural variability argument one step further. Proponents of this claim often point to alternative explanations for global warming, such as increased solar activity or natural methane emissions. They argue that human contributions, particularly carbon dioxide emissions, are negligible compared to these natural processes. This perspective has been amplified by a small but vocal minority of scientists who question the extent of human impact on the climate. One of the most prominent figures in this camp is Richard Lindzen, a retired professor of meteorology at MIT. Lindzen has argued that the climate system is too complex to attribute warming primarily to human activity, a position that has been widely criticized by the scientific community. Despite his minority status among climate scientists, Lindzen's credentials and contrarian views have made him a go-to expert for denialist think tanks and media outlets. His arguments, though often debunked, provide a veneer of legitimacy to the broader denialist movement. The claim that human activity is not the primary driver of climate change also benefits from its alignment with certain economic and ideological interests. Accepting human responsibility for climate change implies a need for significant changes to industrial practices, energy production, and consumption patterns. For industries reliant on fossil fuels, this represents a direct threat to their business models. By questioning the human role in climate change, these industries can delay regulatory measures and maintain the status quo. Perhaps the most insidious claim made by denialists is that scientists are part of a globalist agenda. This argument is less about the science itself and more about undermining the credibility of those who study and report on it. It suggests that climate scientists are motivated not by a search for truth, but by political and financial interests, working in concert with international organizations to push a specific agenda. This narrative has its roots in long-standing mistrust of centralized power and global governance. Organizations like the United Nations and its Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, are often portrayed as overreaching entities seeking to impose regulations and erode national sovereignty. Denialists argue that climate change is a pretext for these organizations to consolidate power and redistribute wealth through mechanisms like carbon taxes and international climate agreements. The globalist agenda claim is particularly potent because it taps into broader conspiracy theories about elites and hidden power structures. It suggests that ordinary people are being manipulated by a small group of scientists, politicians, and corporate leaders who stand to benefit from climate alarmism. This narrative has been amplified by media personalities like Alex Jones, who have built entire platforms on promoting conspiracies about global control. This claim is also bolstered by the perception that climate scientists receive funding and prestige by supporting the mainstream narrative. Denialists argue that dissenting scientists are silenced or marginalized, creating an echo chamber that perpetuates the supposed agenda. In reality, scientific consensus on climate change has been reached through decades of rigorous research, peer review, and independent verification. The idea of a global conspiracy among thousands of scientists across multiple disciplines and countries is not only implausible, but also ignores the transparency and accountability inherent in the scientific process. These four claims, climate change as a hoax, Natural variability as the explanation, the rejection of human causation, and the idea of a globalist agenda have gained traction because they speak to deeper fears and concerns. They offer simple answers to a complex problem, shifting blame away from individuals and systems and onto abstract entities or forces. They also align with broader ideological and economic interests, making them appealing to a wide range of audiences. Understanding where these claims come from and why they resonate is critical to addressing them effectively. Each argument is rooted not just in misinformation, but in emotional and cultural factors that make them resistant to evidence. Countering these narratives requires more than presenting facts. It demands empathy, transparency, and a willingness to engage with the fears and frustrations that drive denial. Only by addressing these underlying issues can we begin to move the conversation forward and take meaningful action on climate change. The role of corporations and lobbyists in fueling climate change denial is a story of calculated resistance to inconvenient truths. It's a tale of powerful industries, particularly those tied to fossil fuels, recognizing the existential threat that climate science posed to their business models and responding with deliberate campaigns to confuse the public, distort the facts, and delay meaningful action. These efforts have been remarkably effective, not because they disproved the science, but because they sowed doubt. Enough doubt to stall political will and muddy public understanding for decades. The fossil fuel industry, which stands to lose the most from a transition to cleaner energy, has been at the forefront of these campaigns. The stakes were clear to them as early as the 1970s and 1980s, when their own scientists began to study the impact of carbon dioxide emissions. Companies like ExxonMobil funded internal research that confirmed what independent scientists were already finding, that burning fossil fuels was driving an increase in greenhouse gas concentrations, which in turn was warming the planet. These findings, detailed in internal memos, could have spurred the industry to lead the charge toward a sustainable future. Instead, they chose a different path, one of obfuscation and denial. ExxonMobil, for instance, is infamous for burying its own climate research and instead embarking on a public relations campaign to discredit climate science. The company funneled millions of dollars into think tanks and advocacy groups that question the link between fossil fuels and climate change. These organizations, such as the Heartland Institute and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, became prolific sources of denialist rhetoric. They produced reports, held conferences, and promoted voices that contradicted the overwhelming scientific consensus, giving the impression that the science was unsettled. This strategy of manufacturing doubt was not new. The fossil fuel industry borrowed heavily from the tactics used by the tobacco industry, which had spent decades denying the link between smoking and lung cancer. The playbook was simple yet devastatingly effective. Emphasize uncertainty, exaggerate the cost of action, and present the issue as a matter of personal choice rather than systemic change. By shifting the narrative from "what should we do about climate change" to "are we even sure it's happening?" these campaigns delayed action and allowed the industry to continue profiting from the status quo. One of the most insidious aspects of this campaign was its reliance on pseudoscience. The industry-funded think tanks produced studies and reports that mimicked the language and structure of legitimate scientific research, but were designed to mislead. These studies often cherry-picked data, ignored context, or used flawed methodologies to cast doubt on established findings. For example, they might highlight short-term cooling trends in specific regions while ignoring the long-term global warming trend, creating a misleading narrative that the climate was not warming after all. These pseudoscientific efforts were amplified by strategic alliances with sympathetic media outlets and politicians. Conservative talk radio, cable news programs, and opinion columns became platforms for denialist talking points, often featuring so-called experts funded by the fossil fuel industry. This media coverage created a false equivalence, where the overwhelming consensus of climate scientists was presented as just one side of a debate, giving equal weight to the minority of skeptics, many of whom had direct financial ties to fossil fuel companies. Lobbying efforts also played a crucial role in shaping public policy, or, more accurately, in preventing it. The fossil fuel industry has spent billions lobbying lawmakers to block climate legislation, weaken environmental regulations, and promote policies that favor continued fossil fuel production. Organizations like the American Petroleum Institute, API, have been instrumental in these efforts, using their influence to shape legislation at both the national and state levels. API's campaigns often frame climate policies as economic threats, warning of job losses, higher energy prices, and economic instability if fossil fuels are phased out. These lobbying efforts are not limited to direct interactions with lawmakers. The industry has also invested heavily in grassroots campaigns designed to create the illusion of widespread public opposition to climate action. Known as astroturfing, these campaigns use fake grassroots organizations to amplify industry-friendly messages. They organize protests, flood public comment periods with identical submissions, and generate media coverage that appears to reflect genuine public sentiment, all while masking their corporate origins. The impact of these efforts has been profound. By casting doubt on the science, promoting skeptical voices, and funding political resistance, the fossil fuel industry has successfully delayed meaningful action on climate change for decades. Policies that could have mitigated the worst impacts of global warming were stalled or abandoned, and public understanding of the issue was undermined. Even as the evidence mounted, denialist rhetoric continued to influence public opinion and political decision-making. This legacy of denial has created a deeply polarized landscape. On one side are those who recognize the urgency of the climate crisis and advocate for bold action. On the other are those who, influenced by decades of misinformation, remain skeptical of the science or resistant to the changes it demands. The fossil fuel industry's campaign of denial didn't just protect their profits, it shaped the entire narrative around climate change, making it one of the most contentious issues of our time. Understanding the role of corporations and lobbyists in climate change denial is essential to moving forward. It reveals the calculated strategies that have stymied progress and underscores the need for greater transparency, accountability, and public awareness. The fight against climate change isn't just a battle against rising temperatures. It's a battle against the misinformation and vested interests that have kept us from addressing the problem head-on. Recognizing this is the first step toward reclaiming the narrative and building a future that prioritizes people and the planet over profit. The psychological appeal of climate change denial lies in its ability to provide a comforting escape from the weight of an inconvenient and unsettling reality. At its core, denial is not just a rejection of science, but a defense mechanism, a way for individuals and groups to shield themselves from the anxiety, fear, and guilt that acknowledging climate change often brings. To understand why people deny climate change, it's crucial to examine the underlying emotional and psychological drivers: fear of change, economic concerns, and a resistance to accepting personal or collective responsibility. Fear of change is one of the most pervasive reasons for denial. Climate change challenges the status quo, threatening to upend familiar ways of life, economic systems, and deeply held beliefs about progress and prosperity. For many, the idea of shifting away from fossil fuels, rethinking consumption patterns, and embracing sustainability feels overwhelming. It's not just a matter of logistics, it's a fundamental disruption to the world they've known. Denial becomes a way to avoid confronting these uncomfortable truths, a way to cling to a sense of stability in a world that feels increasingly uncertain. This fear is compounded by the sheer scale of the problem. Climate change is vast, global, and multifaceted. It involves complex scientific concepts, long-term timelines, and interconnected systems that are difficult to grasp fully. For the average person, trying to comprehend the scope of climate change can feel like staring into an abyss. Denial offers an escape from this existential dread. By dismissing climate change as a hoax or exaggeration, individuals can avoid the paralysis that comes with feeling powerless in the face of such a monumental challenge. Economic concerns also play a significant role in fueling denial. Climate change mitigation requires transformative changes to industries, economies, and daily life, and these changes often come with perceived costs. For those whose livelihoods are tied to fossil fuels, whether they work in coal mining, oil drilling, or related industries, the transition to renewable energy feels like a direct threat to their financial stability. Even for those outside these industries, the prospect of higher energy prices, job losses, or economic disruptions can provoke anxiety. Denial allows people to sidestep these fears, framing climate change as an invented problem that doesn't warrant the sacrifices being asked of them. This economic anxiety isn't limited to individuals. It's also deeply embedded in cultural and political narratives. In many societies, particularly those that emphasize free markets and limited government, climate action is seen as a challenge to economic freedom. Policies like carbon taxes, emissions regulations, and renewable energy mandates are framed not as necessary steps toward sustainability, but as burdens that stifle growth and innovation. For people who hold these views, denying climate change becomes a way to protect their economic ideology, reinforcing their belief that markets, not regulations, are the solution to society's problems. Resistance to accepting responsibility is another key psychological driver of denial. Acknowledging climate change often comes with a sense of guilt. Guilt for contributing to the problem through personal choices, such as driving cars, using energy, or consuming goods that rely on fossil fuels. This guilt can be paralyzing, especially when paired with the realization that these choices are deeply ingrained in daily life. Denial provides a way to deflect this guilt. If climate change isn't real, or if it's not caused by humans, then there's no need to feel bad about personal or collective actions. This resistance to responsibility is amplified by a psychological phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance. When people are confronted with information that conflicts with their behaviors or beliefs, it creates an uncomfortable tension. For example, someone who values environmental stewardship but drives a gas-guzzling SUV may experience dissonance when confronted with the realities of climate change. Denial helps resolve this tension by allowing them to dismiss the information and avoid questioning their choices. The psychological appeal of denial is also rooted in identity and belonging. Climate change has become a deeply polarized issue, tied to political and cultural identities. In many communities, rejecting climate change is seen as a badge of loyalty to a particular worldview. It's not just about the science. It's about aligning with a group's values and rejecting what they see as the intrusion of outside forces. For these individuals, accepting climate change feels like betraying their community or admitting defeat in a broader cultural battle. This group dynamic is reinforced by echo chambers, both online and offline, where people are surrounded by others who share their beliefs. These spaces amplify denialist narratives, providing a sense of validation and solidarity. In these environments, accepting the reality of climate change isn't just a matter of changing one's mind, it's a fundamental shift in identity that feels too risky or alienating to undertake. Finally, denial can stem from a sense of futility. Even for those who accept the reality of climate change, the scale of the problem can feel insurmountable. The idea that individual actions, recycling, driving less, or using renewable energy are just drops in the bucket can lead to feelings of helplessness. For some, it's easier to deny the problem entirely than to grapple with the idea that their efforts may not be enough. Denial becomes a way to avoid the pain of confronting a challenge that feels beyond their control. In the end, the psychological appeal of climate change denial lies in its ability to shield people from fear, guilt, and uncertainty. It offers a sense of stability in a world that feels increasingly chaotic, a way to protect one's identity and beliefs, and an escape from the burden of responsibility. Understanding these psychological drivers is crucial to addressing denial effectively. Countering misinformation is important, but it's not enough. To move the conversation forward, we must also address the fears and anxieties that fuel denial, offering solutions that feel empowering rather than paralyzing, and creating spaces for dialogue that prioritize empathy and understanding. Climate change denial has left an indelible mark on popular culture and media, often serving as both a subject of satire and a platform for polarizing debates. The way denial has been represented in films, television, and news programming reflects broader societal divisions and has shaped public perceptions of the issue in profound ways. Meanwhile, the rise of social media has amplified these representations, creating echo chambers that reinforce entrenched beliefs and make it harder for evidence-based perspectives to break through. One of the most notable examples of climate change denial in popular culture comes from satirical movies that use humor to expose the absurdity of anti-science rhetoric. Films like Don't Look Up, 2021, directed by Adam McKay, offer a biting commentary on how political leaders and media outlets trivialize existential threats. Although the film focuses on a fictional comet hurtling toward Earth, its parallels to climate change are unmistakable. Politicians dismiss the warnings of scientists, media outlets prioritize entertainment over serious discussion, and public opinion is split between those demanding action and those denying the problem entirely. The satire lays bare the cognitive dissonance and willful ignorance that often define the climate debate, highlighting how denial can persist even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Television has also explored themes of climate change denial, often through characters or storylines that caricature skeptics. Comedies like The Simpsons and South Park have poked fun at the ridiculousness of denialist arguments, using humor to make a serious point. In one episode of South Park, for instance, the town dismisses global warming as a hoax, only to suffer a catastrophic flood caused by their inaction. While these portrayals are exaggerated for comedic effect, they resonate because they reflect real-world attitudes and behaviors. On the other side of the cultural spectrum, controversial news programs and pundits have played a significant role in legitimizing climate change denial for millions of viewers. In the United States, networks like Fox News have provided a platform for denialist voices, framing climate science as politically motivated or overly alarmist. Anchors and commentators often present the issue as a debate, giving equal weight to the overwhelming majority of scientists who support the evidence for human-caused climate change and the small minority who dispute it. This false balance creates the impression that the science is unsettled, reinforcing skepticism among viewers. The rhetoric used in these programs often appeals to fear and identity, portraying climate action as a threat to personal freedoms and national sovereignty. Phrases like green tyranny and eco-fascism paint environmental policies as oppressive, feeding into a broader narrative of resistance to government control. These programs don't just report on climate change, they actively shape the way it's perceived, turning a scientific issue into a cultural and political battleground. The advent of social media has further transformed how climate change denial is represented and disseminated. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have become breeding grounds for denialist content, ranging from memes mocking climate activists to videos promoting pseudoscientific claims. The algorithms that drive these platforms prioritize engagement, often amplifying sensationalist or controversial content over nuanced, evidence-based discussions. This dynamic has given denialist narratives an outsized reach, allowing them to spread quickly and gain traction among users who might not otherwise encounter them. Echo chambers on social media exacerbate the problem by reinforcing existing beliefs. When users engage with denialist content, algorithms feed them more of the same, creating a curated reality where skepticism of climate science feels normal and justified. These echo chambers isolate individuals from opposing viewpoints, making it harder for them to encounter credible information or challenge their assumptions. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing cycle where denial becomes deeply entrenched. Pop culture and media representations of climate change denial are not merely reflections of public attitudes, they actively shape them. Satirical portrayals can raise awareness and spark critical thinking, but they often preach to the choir, resonating more with those who already accept the science than with skeptics. Meanwhile, news programs and social media platforms have the power to influence millions, either by amplifying denialist rhetoric or by failing to challenge it effectively. The impact of these representations is profound. They influence how the public understands climate change, how policymakers approach the issue, and how willing society is to take action. By framing the debate in ways that trivialize the science or polarize the discourse, they contribute to a culture of inaction, even as the evidence for climate change becomes impossible to ignore. Understanding the role of pop culture and media in perpetuating denial is essential for addressing the problem. It's not just about correcting misinformation, it's about creating new narratives that resonate with diverse audiences, bridging the divide between skeptics and advocates, and using the power of media to inspire action rather than apathy. Climate change denial may have found a foothold in popular culture and social media, but these same platforms can also be harnessed to build a more informed and engaged public. The challenge lies in shifting the narrative, one story, one portrayal, and one conversation at a time. The costs of climate change denial are not abstract. They are painfully real, unfolding in ways that affect communities, economies, and ecosystems across the globe. Denial doesn't simply reject the science of climate change. It stalls the very actions needed to address it, creating a cascade of consequences that grow more severe with each passing year. By undermining public policy, delaying global action, and worsening environmental degradation, denial ensures that the challenges of climate change become harder, costlier, and more devastating to confront. One of the most immediate impacts of denial is its ability to paralyze policymaking. In democratic systems, public opinion plays a significant role in shaping political priorities. When a significant portion of the population believes that climate change is exaggerated or fabricated, it becomes politically expedient for leaders to downplay the issue. Politicians seeking re-election or support from powerful interest groups often avoid pursuing bold climate policies, fearing backlash from skeptical constituents or losing funding from industries tied to fossil fuels. As a result, critical measures such as transitioning to renewable energy, regulating emissions, and investing in climate resilience are delayed or watered down. This inaction is particularly evident in international negotiations. Agreements like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement rely on collective commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, the influence of denial has led to fractured global efforts, with some nations opting out or refusing to meet their targets. In the United States, for instance, climate change denial has been a significant factor in the country's inconsistent approach to international climate accords. These political vacillations not only hinder progress but also undermine trust between nations, making it harder to achieve the coordinated action necessary to combat a global problem. The delays caused by denial have a compounding effect on the environment. Climate change doesn't wait for political consensus. It accelerates in response to human activity. Every year of inaction means more carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere, more deforestation, and more reliance on fossil fuels. These emissions drive rising temperatures, melting ice caps, and increasingly erratic weather patterns, creating a feedback loop that exacerbates the problem. What might have been manageable with early intervention becomes increasingly catastrophic as time goes on. Environmental damage caused by denial manifests in countless ways. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities, displacing millions of people and eroding critical infrastructure. Extreme weather events, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts are becoming more frequent and severe, wreaking havoc on communities and economies. Biodiversity is under siege, with species disappearing at an alarming rate as habitats are destroyed or altered by climate shifts. These changes are not hypothetical. They are already happening, with denial serving as an accelerant to an unfolding crisis. The economic costs of denial are staggering. Natural disasters linked to climate change have caused billions of dollars in damage, straining local and national budgets. In the absence of proactive measures, governments are forced to spend more on disaster relief and recovery, diverting resources from other critical needs. Insurance companies are grappling with increasing claims, leading to higher premiums or the withdrawal of coverage in high-risk areas. Entire industries, from agriculture to tourism, are being disrupted by changing weather patterns, threatening livelihoods and regional economies. Communities on the front lines of climate change feel these impacts most acutely. Small island nations, low-lying coastal areas, and regions dependent on agriculture are particularly vulnerable to rising seas, extreme weather, and shifting ecosystems. For these communities, denial by wealthier nations and powerful industries isn't just frustrating, it's life-threatening. The refusal to act, often driven by ideological or financial interests, leaves the most vulnerable populations to bear the brunt of a crisis they contributed little to creating. The social costs of denial are equally profound. By stalling action, denial exacerbates inequality, deepens divisions, and erodes trust in institutions. Communities that are already marginalized, whether due to poverty, race, or geography, are often left without the resources needed to adapt to climate impacts. Meanwhile, the perception that governments and corporations are prioritizing profits over people feeds cynicism and disengagement, making it harder to build the consensus needed for effective action. Perhaps the most insidious cost of denial is the opportunity it squanders. Addressing climate change is not just a matter of averting disaster. It's an opportunity to create a more sustainable, equitable, and innovative world. Transitioning to renewable energy could drive economic growth, create millions of jobs, and reduce dependence on finite resources. Investing in green infrastructure and technology could revolutionize transportation, agriculture, and urban living, improving quality of life while reducing environmental harm. Denial, however, stifles these possibilities, trapping societies in outdated systems and preventing the pursuit of transformative solutions. The real costs of denial are not measured solely in dollars or degrees of warming. They are measured in lives disrupted, ecosystems lost, and futures foreclosed. Every delay in action pushes the world closer to tipping points that may be impossible to reverse, from the collapse of polar ice sheets to the release of methane from thawing permafrost. These tipping points threaten to unleash chain reactions that could destabilize the planet's climate system, making mitigation efforts far more difficult and expensive. Understanding these costs is critical to breaking the cycle of denial. The longer societies resist action, the greater the burden future generations will bear. It is not just a failure of science or policy, it is a moral failure, one that prioritizes short-term convenience over long-term survival. The real costs of denial are a sobering reminder of what is at stake and why the fight against misinformation and inaction is so urgent. Only by confronting these realities can we hope to change course and build a future that prioritizes resilience, justice, and the health of the planet. Debunking the myths surrounding climate change requires more than just throwing scientific facts into the conversation. It's about connecting the evidence to real-world examples and showing why the truth is both compelling and undeniable. Climate change denial thrives on narratives that are simple, emotionally resonant, and often misleading. To counter them effectively, we need to make the truth just as accessible and engaging. One of the most pervasive claims is that climate change is a hoax. This myth suggests that climate science is fabricated, often by scientists or global organizations, for political or financial gain. To counter this, it's important to highlight the robust processes behind scientific research. Thousands of scientists across the globe contribute to climate studies, conducting independent research that is peer-reviewed and scrutinized before publication. The overwhelming consensus, 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real and caused by human activities, didn't emerge overnight. It's the result of decades of meticulous work, from ice core studies showing atmospheric carbon dioxide levels over millennia to satellite data documenting changes in global temperatures and sea levels. Moreover, the idea that all these scientists are colluding is not only implausible, but also defies logic. Scientists operate in competitive environments, often seeking to disprove each other's work to advance their fields. If there were a massive flaw in climate science, exposing it would be career-making. The fact that this hasn't happened speaks volumes about the integrity of the data. Another common myth is that the climate has always changed naturally. So today's changes are just part of a normal cycle. While it's true that the Earth's climate has undergone natural fluctuations over millions of years, today's changes are unprecedented in both their speed and cause. Natural factors, such as variations in solar radiation or volcanic activity, operate on timescales of thousands to millions of years. In contrast, the rapid increase in global temperatures and carbon dioxide levels over the past century directly correlates with the Industrial Revolution and the burning of fossil fuels. This acceleration is visible in the data. Pre-industrial carbon dioxide levels hovered around 280 parts per million for thousands of years. Today, they exceed 420 ppm, a spike that has occurred in just over a century. This rapid change is far beyond what natural processes could produce on their own. By looking at carbon isotopes, scientists can even trace the source of this carbon, confirming that it comes primarily from burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. Then there's the argument that human activities aren't significant enough to affect something as vast as the Earth's climate. This claim often appeals to a sense of scale. How could driving cars, flying planes, or burning fuel for energy possibly shift the planet's balance? The answer lies in the sheer quantity of greenhouse gases humans are emitting. Each year, human activities release over 35 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This number is staggering, and its cumulative effect is undeniable. Greenhouse gases trap heat, creating a blanket around the Earth that prevents it from radiating heat back into space. This mechanism is basic physics, understood and confirmed for over a century. To make this relatable, imagine leaving your car in the sun on a summer day with the windows closed. The heat builds up inside because the glass traps the sunlight, creating a greenhouse effect. The same principle applies to the Earth on a planetary scale, with greenhouse gases acting like the car windows. The more gases we emit, the thicker the windows become, and the harder it is for the planet to cool itself. Another myth claims that scientists are part of a globalist agenda, using climate change as a tool for political control. This narrative is particularly tricky because it plays on deep-seated mistrust of authority and globalization. The truth, however, is far less sinister. Organizations like the United Nations and its Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, exist to coordinate efforts to address global problems that no single country can solve alone. Climate change is a perfect example of this. Carbon emissions don't respect borders. A coal plant in one country affects the atmosphere everywhere. Coordinated action isn't about control, it's about practicality and survival. It's also worth pointing out that combating climate change doesn't benefit some shadowy global elite. It benefits everyone. Cleaner air, sustainable energy, and a stable climate improve health, economic security, and quality of life. The transition to renewable energy, for example, creates jobs in industries like solar and wind power while reducing reliance on finite resources. Framing these changes as opportunities, rather than sacrifices, helps counter the fear-based narrative of denial. Another myth that often arises is the idea that addressing climate change will destroy the economy. This claim is rooted in fear, portraying climate action as an economic threat rather than an investment in the future. But the evidence shows that the cost of inaction far outweighs the cost of transitioning to a low-carbon economy. Natural disasters fueled by climate change, hurricanes, wildfires, floods already cost billions of dollars annually in damages, insurance claims, and lost productivity. Preventative measures, like investing in renewable energy and resilient infrastructure, save money in the long run by reducing these risks. Moreover, renewable energy is rapidly becoming more cost-effective than fossil fuels. Solar and wind power are now among the cheapest sources of electricity in many parts of the world, and advancements in battery storage technology are making these energy sources more reliable. Countries that invest in green technology position themselves as leaders in the industries of the future, while those clinging to fossil fuels risk being left behind. Debunking these myths is not just about presenting evidence, it's about framing the truth in ways that resonate with people's values, experiences, and aspirations. Climate change isn't an abstract scientific issue. It's a human issue, affecting our health, livelihoods, and the world we pass on to future generations. By connecting the evidence to these real-world stakes, we can replace denial with understanding and inaction with hope. As we bring this discussion to a close, it's important to focus not just on the challenges we face, but on the opportunities that lie ahead. Climate change is a formidable problem, but it is not insurmountable. The narrative of doom and despair is only part of the story. The other part, the one we don't hear often enough, is the story of innovation, resilience, and the power of collective action to make a difference. There is hope, and that hope lies in education, empowerment, and the choices we make today. Action begins with understanding. The misinformation that fuels climate change denial thrives on confusion and a lack of accessible, reliable information. But we live in an age where the tools to educate ourselves have never been more abundant. Resources like NASA's climate change website, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) reports, and educational platforms like Climate Reality provide clear, evidence-based insights into the science and solutions for climate change. These aren't just resources for scientists or policymakers. They're for anyone who wants to cut through the noise and understand the realities of our warming planet. Education also extends to our conversations. Talking about climate change can feel daunting, especially when faced with skepticism or denial, but these discussions are critical. Sharing knowledge with friends, family, and community members, whether it's through a casual chat, a social media post, or participation in a local event, helps shift the narrative. When people see climate action framed as a shared responsibility rather than an imposition, they're more likely to engage and explore what they can do in their own lives. One of the most hopeful aspects of this moment is the incredible potential for solutions that already exist. Renewable energy is becoming more efficient and affordable, offering a path to decarbonize our economies while creating jobs and reducing pollution. Advances in sustainable agriculture, energy storage, and urban planning are transforming how we live and work, showing that a more sustainable world isn't just necessary, it's achievable. Every solar panel installed, every tree planted, and every piece of legislation passed represents a step forward. Getting involved doesn't require grand gestures. It's about finding the actions that align with your skills, passions, and circumstances. Maybe it's joining a local group advocating for climate policy, volunteering with an environmental organization, or simply making more sustainable choices in your daily life. Small actions, multiplied across millions of people, create powerful momentum. Every choice we make contributes to a broader cultural shift towards sustainability and accountability. It's also worth remembering that addressing climate change isn't just about reducing harm, it's about building a better world. Cleaner air and water, healthier ecosystems, and resilient communities benefit everyone. When we invest in green technology and sustainable practices, we're not just solving a crisis, we're creating opportunities for innovation, equity, and a higher quality of life for generations to come. The urgency of climate action can feel overwhelming, but it also brings with it the possibility of transformation. What gives me the most hope is the rising wave of awareness and action, especially among younger generations. They've grown up in a world where the reality of climate change is undeniable, and they're demanding accountability and change. Movements like Fridays for Future, led by Greta Thunberg, have galvanized millions of people around the world, showing that the power to make a difference doesn't depend on age, wealth, or status. It depends on commitment and courage. Their voices remind us that it's not too late to act, and that every effort matters. So as you reflect on what we've discussed today, I encourage you to take the next step, whatever that looks like for you. Educate yourself, engage with your community, and explore ways to reduce your own carbon footprint. Whether it's switching to renewable energy, supporting sustainable businesses, or advocating for policy changes, your actions contribute to the ripple effect of progress. The most important thing is to begin, because hope isn't passive, it's active, and it's something we create through the choices we make. We're in this together, and together we have the power to turn the tide. The challenges are great, but so is the potential for change. By embracing education, action, and collaboration, we can move past the barriers of denial and build a future rooted in truth, resilience, and hope. This isn't just a fight to prevent catastrophe, it's an opportunity to create something better, and that, more than anything, is worth fighting for. As we close out today's episode, I want to leave you with a challenge, a call to action that's as simple as it is important. The fight against climate change isn't just happening in government halls or research labs, it's happening in our everyday conversations, in the questions we ask, and in the choices we make. Each of us has a role to play, and it begins with curiosity and courage. Start by questioning what you hear, especially when it comes to climate change. In a world flooded with information, it's easy for false narratives to take root. Misinformation often thrives on repetition and emotional appeal, but truth demands a little more effort. Take the time to look deeper, to verify sources, and to explore the evidence behind the claims. Credible resources like NASA, the IPCC, or even local universities provide clear, accessible insights into the science. When you arm yourself with knowledge, you're not just protecting yourself from misinformation, you're equipping yourself to share the truth with others. But knowledge alone isn't enough. It's what you do with it that matters. Talk about climate change. Bring it up with your friends, your family, and your community. These conversations might feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you encounter skepticism, but they're essential. Climate change doesn't need to be a polarizing topic. It's a human one, and discussing it in a way that connects to shared values and concerns can make all the difference. Your words might be the spark that gets someone else to start thinking, learning, and taking action. This isn't about being perfect or doing it all at once. It's about starting where you are with what you have. Maybe that's attending a town hall meeting on local climate initiatives, joining a cleanup effort in your neighborhood, or simply cutting back on energy use at home. Every small step contributes to the larger momentum, and every voice added to the conversation strengthens the push for change. Don't underestimate the power of individual action. It multiplies, inspires, and ultimately drives the collective shifts we need. And let's remember this: action isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about building something better. Climate change is a challenge, yes, but it's also an opportunity to reimagine our relationship with the planet and each other. Cleaner energy, sustainable communities, and healthier ecosystems aren't just goals, they're possibilities within our reach. By stepping up and stepping in, you're contributing to a vision of the future that's not only sustainable, but vibrant and full of promise. So here's the takeaway: question, learn, and speak up. Explore the resources that help you separate fact from fiction. Engage with the people around you and share what you know. And most importantly, act. Because the fight against climate change isn't a distant battle. It's here, now, in the choices we make every day. Together, we can push back against denial, misinformation, and inaction. Together, we can make a difference. It starts with us, and it starts today. Let's get to work.